I would like to welcome all of you who come to today's lecture organized by GPA Department of Chinese University. Lecture by Professor Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Professor Diamond recently became very famous in Hong Kong because he served as the supervisor of a certain MA thesis. But for us political scientists, Professor Diamond doesn't need any introduction, especially for those of us who work on democracy and democratization. Professor Diamond is a leading scholar in the study of democratization, and he is also co-founder of the very influential Journal of Democracy. And Professor Diamond writes extensively on the issue of democratization, very prolifically. And I thought of bringing my collection of Professor Diamond's writings to the floor to show you how prolific it is. But then I discovered that this is literally a very heavy task, so I gave up. But for the record, Professor Diamond is the author and editor of some 30 books, most of them related to democratization and democracy, and numerous other journals and other articles. But Professor Diamond is not an armchair academic. He also traveled extensively all over the world, from Taiwan to Nigeria, studying, researching, and teaching, and studying how democracy is being carried out all over the world. And he also recently, as some of you may know, served as the advisor for the US government concerning how to build democratic institutions in the post-war Iraq. Today, he's going to give a lecture on the topic, relatively long one, can the whole world be democratic? Force on remaining obstacles to democratization from a global perspective. Okay, I think the 200 of you do not come to hear my introduction. So I think I better leave more time for Larry. Larry, time's yours.
Is there going to be a means of showing my slides? Well, I would thank first Professor Ma for his very generous introduction. Second, my very good friend and longtime colleague at Stanford University, now your Vice Chancellor, Professor Larry Lau, for his warm welcome and invitation again, and of course, all of you for coming. I have been thinking for some years now about and studying the global transformation of the last 30 years, a transformation, as I will explain, that has seen for the first time in history a majority of the independent states and self-governing political systems in the world become democracies. And now that we have a majority of the world's political systems as democracies, it raises the question, well, how far can this go? Is it possible to imagine a world in which all of the countries of the world are democracies? And I know that this is a rather bold argument to be making, and I think it's perhaps a more fragile argument now than it was when I wrote the first version of this paper and delivered it more than 3 years ago. But I believe it is imaginable that we will someday live in a world. I think it's more likely that it will be the students here in the audience than perhaps me personally. But we will someday live in a world in which all of the countries of the world will be democracies. So the first thing I'd like to do with you today is to share the trends in global democratic development over the past 30 years since this remarkable transformation began in April of 1974 with the Portuguese Revolution that overthrew the Salazar Cayetano dictatorship in Portugal and started a wave of democratic changes that, as I will describe, has swept the world, or almost every part of the world except for one, in the last 3 decades. Then I'd like to review some of the caveats to this democratic trend, some of the problems of democratic functioning. I'll talk about some of the factors that have driven global democratic expansion over the last 3 decades. And I'll think about, well, what are the obstacles that remain to global democratic expansion. So if I could have the first slide. There we go. So as you can see, this first slide shows simply the number of electoral democracies that have existed in the world over the last 30 years at any point in time. How am I defining democracy? Well, here I am indicating those systems in the world. I'm sorry for the 2 people in the room who had to sit through this while they were taking my class on global democratic development at another point in time. But maybe there's nothing wrong with a bit of refresher. Those are the political systems in the world that choose their leaders and replace their leaders at regular intervals through free, fair, competitive, meaningful elections. And I can go into further detail about what constitutes free and fair, but I think you can imagine there has to be a relatively level playing field. There has to be freedom of association in the press, at least to some degree. There has to be neutral administration of the electoral process. There has to be a right of political parties to form and contest without serious restraint and without the results being disfigured by electoral fraud or favoritism. Now, if you look at the trends, you see that when the third wave started in 1974, there were only about 41 democracies in the world. These were mainly in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. A few countries that we then called the Third World had democracies: India, Sri Lanka, Costa Rica, Botswana, but not too many. And this was barely a quarter of all the independent states of the world. What happened is that shortly after the transition to democracy began in Portugal, the longtime Spanish dictator Francisco Franco died. A transition to democracy began in Spain. Around the same time, in the mid-1970s, the Greek military dictatorship fell, and within a few years you had democracy really throughout Western Europe, including Portugal, Spain, and Greece. By the mid to late 1970s, the democratic trend spread to Latin America. You had a wave of democratic transitions there, and in countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, several Central American countries all became democracies between 1979 and 1985. Chile somewhat later, around 1989, 1990. At the same time, you know that the democratic wave began in East Asia with Ferdinand Marcos's rather ill-considered decision announced on American television. I was watching Ted Koppel when he did it, to call snap elections in the Philippines that he felt confident in calling because he knew he could steal them, and did. But what he did not count on was the resolve and level of organization and courage of Philippine Democrats that would come into the streets, present the evidence of electoral fraud on the basis of their monitoring, and with international support, not least from the United States, reverse those stolen elections and bring Corazon Aquino to power. It was not long after that that the South Korean military dictatorship was forced by mass demonstrations in the streets in 1987, and again, American diplomatic pressure, very crucially timed, to yield to opposition demands for direct election of the president, which happened in December of 1987 and then led to the transition to democracy in South Korea. And that was, of course, as you know, right around the same time that martial law was being lifted in Taiwan, and a transition to democracy was beginning there, that then unfolded over about an 8-year period and culminated with the direct election of the president in Taiwan in 1996. And during this period as well, you saw the gradual transition of Thailand from a kind of military-influenced semi-democracy to a more freewheeling and genuine electoral democracy by around the late 1980s, early 1990s. Of course, this was interrupted by a military coup in Thailand in the early 1990s, what I think will prove to have been the last military coup in Thailand's history, although obviously it's going through a rough patch now. And so, you know, by the early 1990s, you had some 40%, almost 50% of all the independent states in the world being democracies. Now, I hardly need to tell you what happened in 1989 that began to further dramatically transform the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 not only had a profound impact on the former communist world, leading in fairly rapid fashion to the transition to democracy of most of the Warsaw Pact states in Central Europe, or what was then called Eastern Europe. Pleased to acknowledge the presence of the Czech Consul General, who I think was probably not only experienced, but in some way involved in that process. And of course, the Czech Republic is one of the most successful new democracies that has resulted from that process. But of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. There were transitions to democracy, or at least regime changes, in a number of the successor states in the former Soviet Union. And the fall of the Berlin Wall had a very profound impact on sub-Saharan Africa as well. Because for the first time, the 48 states of sub-Saharan Africa could be viewed by the West on their own terms and not as a contest ground in the Cold War struggle for global dominance. And freed from concern about Cold War competition with the Soviet Union for influence and control of resources in sub-Saharan Africa, Western countries like the United States, Britain, and very crucially, France, began to put pressure on African states to hold competitive elections and to have more transparent, responsive, accountable governance, which led to a number of transitions in sub-Saharan Africa as well. As a result, by the early 1990s, you had well over half of the independent states of the world being democracies. You had a very sharp rate of increase on an annual basis in the number of democracies. And of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of Yugoslavia, and the coming into life of some new post-colonial states, you had an increase in the total number of states in the world. By the mid-1990s, the democratic trend had reached an equilibrium state that it has roughly preserved for the last 10 years. That is, the number of democracies in the world as a total proportion of independent states in the world hasn't changed very much in the last 10 years. Now, these are democracies, the number of democracies, as listed by the independent organization in New York that produces an annual report on political rights and civil liberties, Freedom House. Freedom House rates all of the independent states in the world on a 7-point scale of political rights and a 7-point scale of civil liberties, with 1 being the most free and 7 being the most repressive. And I'm going to come to those numbers in a minute. These are just the states it counts as electoral democracies. You see a slight increase here in 2005, but I don't attach much significance to it. Moreover, I would argue that if you look at some of these states very carefully and ask, how free and fair are their elections really? It might be hard to justify the claim that they really are electoral democracies. And I think that that would be true, for example, for one country that I've studied very closely over the years, and that is Nigeria. Now, it's useful to look at the data in terms of the trends of transition to democracy over time. And here we see that quite a striking percentage of the states that were not democratic in 1974, that existed in 1974, but were not democratic then, have since become democracies. Of the 109 states that were not democracies in 1974, 55% of them, that is a total of 60, have made transitions to democracy since. Of the states that were colonies of other countries and became independent after 1974, a total of 22 of those 27 states have become democracies in the post-1974 period. 15 of them as a result of being a democracy at independence and remaining continuously so. 7 not being a democracy at independence, but becoming a democracy later. So the total is 85% of these 27 states. And they break down, I don't see how to lower this table, but they break down in the following way. 11 of them were, 22 of them were post-colonial states. Then you have an additional 11 post-communist states, and 58% of them have become democracies. So there have been a total of 33 new states that have emerged since 1974. And of those 33 new states, 72% of them have become democracies. That's quite an impressive record, and it speaks as well to the democratic trend in the world. Now, one of the reasons why this democratic trend has continued is because once countries have become democratic during this period, very few of them have ceased to become democratic. That is, there have been relatively few breakdowns of democracy in this period. And I've tempted to count the total number of countries that had democracy in this period and lost that. And I count the total number to date at 16. 9 of these had a breakdown of democracy at some point with a subsequent return to democracy, and that includes countries like Fiji, Ghana, India very briefly during the emergency period in the 1970s, Nigeria, Peru during the period of the auto golpe or self-coup of Alberto Fujimori, Thailand during the period of the military coup, Turkey, Zambia. Then there are another 7 countries that have suffered breakdowns or reversals of democracy in which to this date democracy has not returned. And those include countries like Russia, Sudan, Pakistan, and Venezuela. Also Lebanon, although one could debate how much Lebanon might have returned to democracy by now, and Nepal, which I think is in the process of returning to democracy. Of course, you can see here that this particular table makes the presumption that a breakdown of democracy can emerge in rather subtle ways. It doesn't always happen because the military comes into power and overthrows the constitutional elected government. It doesn't always happen because the ruler who's been elected declares himself a dictator and suspends parliament, as Fujimori did, I believe, in 1991. Sometimes it happens by more subtle means. All of the existing constitutional framework may survive with minor modifications, but presidential power becomes so inflated, and the freedom of opposition, both in civil society and the political party system, becomes so constrained, and the electoral rules become so manipulated that the country can no longer be said to be a democracy. And I think that is what has happened in Russia under Vladimir Putin, and that is what has happened in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. So the total number of breakdowns is 16, and as a percentage of all of the democracies that have existed during this period, that's about 12.5% of all the democracies. Not a very high failure rate, and in terms of enduring failure, smaller still. Now, one of the most striking features of this wave of democratic change, as I began to track it and relate it to levels of economic development, is that the relationship that my intellectual mentor and thesis advisor, Seymour Martin Lipset, identified between economic development and democracy has begun to break down at one end of the spectrum. At the high end of the spectrum, the relationship remains extremely powerful. If you look, as I am doing here, at the low end of the spectrum, but if you look for a minute at the high end of the spectrum of human development, as measured annually by the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index, and if you look at the top 25 systems in human development, you'll see that among the top 25, there are only 2 non-democracies. One is Singapore, and the other is Hong Kong. All the other top 25 states in human development are at least electoral democracies, most of them very liberal democracies. If you look at the top 50 most developed states in the world by the Human Development Index, the only countries that are not democracies, in addition to Singapore and Hong Kong, are the oil-rich states, primarily of the Persian Gulf. If you study the lower end of the spectrum, so I think that that relationship survives at the very high end. Singapore is by far the richest, most developed country in the world that is not a democracy. There's never been such an instance before in the history of organized states. And it's a matter of speculation, and I offered my own speculation upon it when I was in Singapore last week about whether Singapore will remain a non-democracy. And if you want to know what I said in Singapore, you can ask me when I'm done with the lecture. But what strikes me is what has happened at the other end of the spectrum, a development for which, again, there is no precedent in the history of the world. We're now in a situation where if we look at the 36 countries in the world that the UN Development Program classifies as having low human development, 15 of these 36 least developed countries are now democracies. And these include Mali, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, but is now a democracy. Niger, which is a less robust democracy than Mali. Sierra Leone, which is a fragile post-conflict democracy. Mozambique, which is one of those countries that I'd say is somewhat ambiguous in terms of whether it's a democracy, but still it's not unimpressive. Of course, it is striking that most of these countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, but some of them have become, like Senegal, fairly liberal democracies. This column on the right-hand side is the average freedom score. If you average the scales of political rights and civil liberties, this is the average score, again, with one being most free and 7 being least free. Once a country gets a score of 2, 2.5, even 3 on the scale, that's fairly liberal in terms of levels of freedom, not necessarily in terms of good governance. And so you can see quite a number of poor countries with fairly liberal or free societies. If we widen our scope to look at the bottom third of states in terms of human development, including both the low and low-medium human development index countries, the percentage of electoral democracies rises to 46%, that is 27 of the 59 states. And about a dozen of these countries have been democracies for more than a decade. So that statistic that Adam Przeworski and his colleagues identified some years ago, that, well, you might have democracy emerge in a low-income country, but it's got a very short life expectancy. It's got a 7 or 8% chance of dying in any given year, doesn't seem to be holding anymore for many of these countries. Now, I'll note just one other statistic, which is the regional patterning of the democratic trend. And here you find that all of the states of Western Europe and the 4 Anglophone states are democracies and now liberal democracies. I have a very simple empirical indicator of when a country is free enough in its politics and civil society to be called a liberal democracy rather than simply an electoral democracy. And that indicator is if it gets a score no worse than 2 on the 7-point scale on civil liberties and no worse than 2 on political rights. So 1 or 2 on each scale, and a country can be called a liberal democracy. And so that is what is appearing in this column. By that standard, all of the states of Western Europe are liberal democracies, and quite a striking percentage of the states of Latin America and the Caribbean. Disproportionately, these are Caribbean island states, but by no means exclusively. Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and several other Latin American countries are now liberal democracies. You can see a very significant improvement for a 7-point scale in the average score of political rights and civil liberties, down to an average score of about less than 2.5, which means better than 2.5 on the 7-point scale. In Central and Eastern Europe, including the former Soviet Union, of the 27 states there, 63% are now democracies. About 2 of every 5, concentrated almost exclusively in Central Europe, that is not in the former Soviet Union, are liberal democracies. And of course, during this 30-year period, there has been an utter transformation in levels of freedom. You can see the patterning in Asia. The Pacific Island states are overwhelmingly democratic, fairly liberal ones. In the 25 states of East, Southeast, and South Asia, about half of them are democracies. I'm not counting Hong Kong here because it's not an independent state. And there's been more modest improvement in levels of freedom. A transformation in sub-Saharan Africa. Half of the 48 states are rated by Freedom House as democracies. I'm a bit more skeptical, which is why you see this italicized figure here. I think if you look carefully, one might say that several of those states are perhaps not quite democracies because of the levels of electoral fraud. But nevertheless, you now have 1/6 of these African states that are, in fact, fairly liberal democracies in terms of levels of freedom. So what is striking about this table is not only the improvement over time, but how little that improvement has touched one particular region of the world, the Middle East, where other than Turkey and Israel, there are no democracies, and other than Turkey, Lebanon and Israel, there have never been any democracies. And I certainly, we can talk about this too if you'd like, would not count Iraq as a democracy today. I'll be glad to explain why, but I have a sneaking suspicion I don't need to. Now, what is the reason for this? Some people say it's Islam because the Middle East is overwhelmingly, predominantly Muslim. Here I would note that there are 43 independent states in the world. It's hard to get statistics on this, so we could be off in our estimates by 1 or 2 countries. There are 43 independent states in the world that are predominantly Muslim. 16 of those are in the Arab Middle East, and the other 27 of those are outside it, in Africa and Asia, primarily. Now, if you look at the 16 countries of the Arab Middle East, none of them are democracies, and their freedom levels are extremely bad. If you look at the other 27 countries that are predominantly Muslim, including countries like Mali, Senegal, Niger, Bangladesh, Indonesia, 7 of them are electoral democracies. They may be, in the case of Bangladesh, quite fragile, illiberal electoral democracies, but they're not all such. Senegal and Mali are doing pretty well. Indonesia is doing better than expected. And so if you look at the average freedom levels of some of these predominantly Muslim countries, as my colleague Alfred Stapon has done in a Journal of Democracy article, you see they're more likely to have than the other countries levels of political freedom and democracy and years of democratic experience much better than you would expect from, if you merely predicted, from their level of economic development. In short, it is possible to argue, and I would argue, that Islam is at best only a modest part of the explanation, and I will come back to the way I think it becomes part of the explanation. But it's not Islam as a faith or culture that is the explanation here. I think it has more to do with this phenomenon, the Arab world, and the peculiar circumstances politically, geopolitically, economically of the Arab Middle East today, the oil-rich Arab Middle East today, that make it a peculiarly inhospitable ground for democratic development. I would like now to talk about the caveats very briefly, and then I'm going to come back to them. It's not been all sweetness and light in the last 30 years, or even in the last few years, and that is why there have been 16 breakdowns of democracy. One also has to note that in addition to those 16 countries, there are quite a number of other new or not so old democracies in the world, democracies of the third wave, that are not functioning particularly well or admirably or smoothly. And one hardly needs to step out of the region of East and Southeast Asia to see the problems. The problems of corruption and abuse of power in countries like the Philippines and Thailand and even Taiwan. The problems of excessive, I would say at times irresponsible, mobilization of ethnic identity and nationalism in some countries like Taiwan. The problems of polarization spilling over into the streets, as we're seeing now, and not for the first time in Taiwan. The problems of mobilization of religious and sectarian divisions into politics in polarizing ways, as we saw in Pakistan one of the factors that contributed to the breakdown of democracy there. The fairly widespread weakness of the rule of law and of governance norms, the widespread perception that corruption is rampant, and the cynicism that breeds about parties and politicians, which also helped to generate the ripe circumstances for military overthrow of democracy in Pakistan in 1999. The problems of disorder, criminal violence, militia activity, Islamist radical terrorist mobilization that are destabilizing some of these new democracies and leading people to wonder in some cases, would we be better off with an authoritarian regime that would at least provide order? It's very important to appreciate, and believe me, I learned this lesson in a very visceral way during my brief time in Iraq, that if you don't have order, then you can't have any other desirable element of governance. Because before you can have a democratic state, you must first have a state. And the fundamental condition, going back to the writings of Max Weber, but you could go back, hundreds, if not thousands of years in political theory before that, the fundamental condition of having a viable state is that it have a monopoly on the legitimate means of violence and some real control over its territory. And the fact of the matter is that there are many states now that don't have a sufficient degree of that to be a very good, stable, viable democracy. And there are others, as in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Afghanistan, that couldn't do so without the very significant presence of international troops. So we have some very sobering circumstances now in Asia, but internationally. Very few of the new democracies of the third wave, perhaps some in Latin America, I think a few in Africa, most of the ones in Central Europe, but overall not very many of the 80 or so new democracies of the third wave have managed to consolidate themselves, have managed to develop such a depth and quality of institutional functioning and such a broad and enduring commitment of their people to democracy unequivocally as the best form of government, that we can be confident that these democracies are stable and will last for a long period of time. So if we don't address some of these problems of democratic dysfunctionality, we can't be confident that the third wave of democracy is going to survive and that it will not yield to a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns as the previous two waves of democracy earlier in history have done. Now, I want to review with you, if I may now, some of the reasons why democracy has spread so broadly in the world during these last 30 years. And then I'll interrogate some of the reasons why we may still see democracy threatened, and then I'll welcome your questions and comments. One reason why democracy has spread so broadly in the world is, in a way, a cultural one. And it's not just a question of national political cultures. It is very significantly a matter of global normative transformation. The fact that democracy has increasingly become, during the last 30 years, a universal value. A strong case can be made for example, and this is why you see the data that you have about the distribution of democracy across levels of development, that democracy is not an extravagance for the poor, but very nearly a necessity. And as you know, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen makes precisely this argument when he writes, "People in economic need also need a political voice. Democracy is not a luxury that can await the arrival of general prosperity. Moreover, there is very little evidence that poor people, given the choice, prefer to reject democracy." Of course, his arguments resonate very powerfully, not only the experience with India, but also very strikingly with the experience of sub-Saharan Africa, where we have, as we do in other regions, a growing profusion of public opinion survey data that can tell us precisely what the people think. And that evidence, which is now entering its third round of public opinion surveys in Africa, in the Afrobarometer, tells us that 2/3 of Africans associate democracy not with economic goods or what it can deliver in a material sense, but with civil liberties, popular sovereignty, or electoral choice. Over these three surveys, it's declining a little bit from about 2/3 to closer to 60%, but still the vast majority of Africans surveyed last year in 12 countries, 3 in every 5, say that democracy is always preferable to authoritarian rule. The same proportion reject one-party rule, 4 in 5 reject military or one-man rule. Latin Americans overall, again by a majority, believe democracy is always preferable. 70% of Latin Americans agree that democracy may have its problems, but it's the best form of government. In East Asia, where I will admit the data is not quite as favorable in terms of public support for democracy as measured by some of these questions, nevertheless, only a quarter in Taiwan and Korea, only a fifth in Hong Kong and the Philippines, less than a tenth in Thailand believe that democracy is not really suitable for their country. In all 5 of these systems, as measured by our East Asia Barometer a few years ago, based in Taiwan, but with participation of one of your own distinguished former professors here, consistently strong majorities, usually upwards of 2/3, reject authoritarian alternatives to democracy. If you look at the data from Muslim majority countries or countries where there are large percentages of Muslims, as the Afrobarometer has done, you find that religion doesn't seem to have any impact. Muslims are as supportive of democracy as non-Muslims. In 4 African countries with substantial Muslim populations, the Afrobarometer has found that large majorities of Muslims as well as non-Muslims support democracy. And there doesn't seem to be any relationship mediated by the degree of religiosity. That is true in the emerging data from the Middle East as well, and from Central Asia, where we see that Islam appears to have much less influence on political attitudes than is often suggested, and religious Muslims are not less supportive of democracy than more secular ones. Amartya Sen argues that the mark of a universal value is not that it has the consent of everyone, but that, quote, people anywhere may have reason to see it as valuable, end quote. By this measure, there is growing evidence that democracy is becoming a truly universal value. So that is one reason why I think it has become more universal as a political system. I'm going to review the other 5 reasons now very, very briefly. One is economic development. During the last 30 years, a lot of countries have become richer. And countries like Taiwan and Korea and Thailand have made transitions to democracy, some in Latin America as well, in part because their high levels of literacy and of economic development have brought about the kind of value transformation I'm talking about and have made for a smoother transition to democracy. Not all countries. Singapore, of course, stands out as the most striking example, but most of them that have become wealthy. Second, economic performance has weighed in, and here authoritarian states face a dilemma, a kind of catch-22. Most authoritarian states are not able any longer to legitimate their rule by some ideology of authoritarian governance. The ideology of authoritarianism as an end in itself, as a good way of governing, has largely been destroyed by this wave of democratic change and by this normative transformation around the world. And so, of course, even the regime in the People's Republic of China now, and Vietnam, not to mention most of the other authoritarian regimes around the world, largely have to resort to performance arguments to derive their legitimacy. We are good because we are necessary in order to achieve development. We are good because we are necessary in order to hold the country together and have order. Well, the problem with legitimating yourself as an authoritarian regime on the basis largely of performance is that in the end, you're likely to be in trouble either way, and this is the catch-22. If you perform, at some point, the country's going to become much more developed, much more orderly in an organic and sustainable sense, with much higher levels of education and prosperity, and the reason for your existence is likely to have exhausted itself, and people are going to ask, with their higher levels of prosperity and the values having been transformed in part by development and global integration, what about us? What about participation? What about voice? What about freedom? And the record over time, I'll cheat now and tell you what I said in Singapore in a sentence, is that I think the record in Singapore will ultimately show that when people have these levels of prosperity and undergo the post-materialist value transformations that have been demonstrated in the World Values Survey that Ronald Inglehart of the University of Michigan and his colleagues have written about, they want freedom as well. If the regime fails to perform in delivering development, then its logic of legitimation is disrupted and contradicted in a more immediate sense, and people are likely to want, although repression for some period of time can thwart them from getting a freer and more democratic political system. So economic performance in either respect has been a factor bringing about democratic change in the world. Then the third factor was the reorientation of the Catholic Church from an institution globally that was endorsing political authoritarian stability and allying itself with it to one that became a normative basis for human rights and democratic change in Latin America, in the Philippines, elsewhere around the world. The fourth change, or maybe fifth now, is at the level of international actions and pressures, both the efforts on the part of the United States, the European Union, and other states to promote and support democratic change around the world in a number of specific instances that I've referred to, and regional organizations and efforts to promote democratic change, of which, of course, the European Union is the most successful phenomenon in the history of the world. There has never been a more powerful extra-national or intranational democracy promotion force than the European Union integration process with its Copenhagen criteria. But we also have the growth of some of these norms of collective expectation of democracy and collective defense of democracy in the Americas, in the Organization of American States, which has revised its charter over the last 15 years to provide for the collective defense of democracy and to require that all its members be democracy, and which in 3 instances during the 1990s saw collective intervention in Guatemala, Peru, and Paraguay, and in Guatemala and Paraguay quite successfully to deter or reverse coups against democracy. I should also note that global normative change is not just at the level of what people privately value, it's at the level of international and regional instruments and treaties. And there has been a gradual evolution of international law and international treaties toward the identification of democracy as a human right. If you look at the International Covenant and civil and political rights and add up all the rights of freedom of speech, association, and so on that are delineated in that covenant, the only thing that's missing is the right to multi-party political competition through free and fair, internationally monitored, transparent elections. And that is precisely a right that was identified in the year 2000 in the Community of Democracies meeting, which released the Warsaw Declaration, enumerating the most detailed set of rights to democracy ever delineated in such a broad gathering. 106 independent states signed on to that document. Now, I'd like to conclude by talking again about the obstacles. This has been a remarkable ride that we've had toward greater democracy and freedom in the world over the last 3 decades, but it's one that, as you've seen from the data that I showed you earlier, has leveled out and largely stalled over the last 10 years. And it's one that is still quite vulnerable to a larger scale reversal because of the problems that we see with the world in general and some of the new democracies in the world. So why are there not more democracies coming into being now? Well, the least common explanation, though one we cannot entirely dismiss, is authoritarian success. This can account for Singapore and Malaysia, for China, and now a very rapidly growing Vietnam, but not for the majority of the remaining non-democratic states in the world. You do have a few communist holdouts, and there is a kind of logic of control under communism that may provide for some period of time a special degree of immunity, but I don't think this gets us very far either. And one of the other remaining communist holdouts, Cuba, would have been a democracy, in my opinion, long ago if we hadn't so isolated it, demonized, and marginalized it, we, the United States, with our misguided sanctions regime. The third reason one could identify is that a lot of authoritarian leaders simply don't care very much about their countries and enjoy having unchallenged power so much that they will use any means necessary to hold on to it. And that explains a certain number of authoritarian rulers in the world, in Africa, Central Asia, and so on, but I don't think it serves very well as a social science model. I'd like to note 2 possible diffusion effects here. One is that as long as there are models of authoritarian success, and here I underscore the crucial significance of Singapore, to which so many authoritarian states, including one you're well familiar with in Hong Kong, look to as possible models or destinations. As long as there is a model of authoritarian vibrancy and success, it is possible to believe and argue to your own people that democracy is not any kind of necessary or inevitable destination. Fifth, you have the other diffusion effect, and that is the examples of democratic failure or dysfunctionality. Every time you have a Pakistan which implodes on itself because of corruption and misrule, or a Taiwan which may have made, actually in my mind, remarkable democratic progress in many respects, but has polarization spilling out into the streets, people say, do we want that? And Lee Kuan Yew can say, frankly, I told you so. Sixth is oil, and the fact that in the world of today, a lot of the remaining authoritarian states, quite frankly, a surprising percentage of them, are oil-based economies, which derive through centralized control over the rents from oil revenue, the ability to maintain their regime and buy off or co-opt opposition. Russia, Azerbaijan, Venezuela, many of the authoritarian states of the Middle East, and particularly the Persian Gulf, obviously Iran, a regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was really failing in some ways before the latest spike in world oil prices. Seventh, why the Arab world is so undemocratic? Well, I've mentioned oil. Let me also mention the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is a very convenient excuse that Arab states can point to in saying we can't democratize now because we need to stand in solidarity against this neo-colonial enterprise, Israel, which is stealing Arab-Palestinian land. Until the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is settled, it will be an excuse, a diversion, a blinding distraction that Arab regimes use to deflect pressure for democratization. Eighth, and also relevant to the Islamic world, is to the Arab world, is Islamic radicalism. I'm not saying Islam is a religion here, but the rise of Islamic extremism and the ability of regimes to point to that threat to justify their own authoritarian clampdown. And let me say, one of the problems in the Arab world is that many of the professional, bourgeois, middle-class elements of society who would be leading the charge for democratization don't do it in countries like Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt out of fear. The fear, very well justified, that if there was an immediate opening to democracy, the radical Islamists would win the election, and the result would not be democracy, but a new form of authoritarianism. I'll close, and really close, with two other factors. One is the rising power of authoritarian states. Russia, as a result of its new infusion of oil revenues, and China, as a result of its remarkable developmental success and its very rapid ascent to global power status. And of course, they now have joined together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I think clearly has implications for countering pro-democratic pressures in Central Asia. Finally, the unilateralism and imperial overreach of the United States, I think, has done a lot of damage to the cause of global democratic expansion. We are now in a period of backlash against democracy promotion that didn't have to happen and has been brought on. I don't want to blame it all on the Bush administration. I think there's been this tendency to arrogance in the American approach to this effort in the world for some time, but has been brought on in particular by the excessive moralism and unilateralism of the Bush administration approach to these issues, embodied in particular by our failed intervention in Iraq. So I don't think that these factors, daunting though they are, logically must triumph over the factors pressing for democratization. I think it is possible that we can get a better energy policy in the West. I think it is possible that we can ultimately settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if we would get serious about mediating it again. I think it is possible that we can improve the functioning of the new democracies of the world that are not functioning very well and consolidate them so that they become models of governance that inspire a desire for democratic governance elsewhere in the world. And you may be surprised to hear this, I also think we can get a better, a more nuanced, more humble, more multilateral approach to democracy promotion on the part of my own country. Thank you very much.
Okay. We have no more than 20 minutes for Q&A session. And because of time constraint, I think we'll keep the Q&A session to faculty and students only. So members of the press, I'm sorry about this. Okay, any questions? Victoria?
Thank you. The question you wanted us to ask you about Singapore, but then you answered the question yourself. So can I ask you about Hong Kong? Because I've heard for most of my adult life that, you know, democracy stands for stability and prosperity in Hong Kong. So I would like to hear a comment on that.
I think that whether democracy serves stability and prosperity or not, in part depends on the historical moment. Timing is very important. And on the structuring of democratic institutions. And to those who argue that non-democratic institutions are necessary to preserve stability and prosperity in Hong Kong, I would ask, how well have non-democratic institutions done that in recent years? And is there, in fact, a problem with governability in Hong Kong and the ability to have legislation and creative and effective policy responses to the social and economic problems that challenge Hong Kong that may derive precisely from its non-democratic nature, and, for example, from the fact that this argument is obviously not original to me, that the chief executive floats above politics with no basis really of popular support, no basis of party support, no organic means of securing majority support in the LegCo. I think it's possible to argue on the basis of logic, first of all, and clear analysis of the political situation here, but also on the basis of comparative experience, that you would get better governance and more effective and creative responses to Hong Kong's policy challenges with democracy than without it. But I would just hasten to add, and since this is going to be the subject of a lecture I'm going to give tomorrow for the Cervantes Institute, I'm not going to dwell on it now, that it matters a lot how democracy is structured. One of the reasons why Taiwan has this problem that it has now is that it has a colossally bad set of institutions that are extremely ill-designed for the country and its cleavages and its problems. And the political scientists warned about this 10 years ago when they urged a parliamentary system upon Taiwan and a different type of electoral system than the one they've staggered through until finally it was changed for the next election.
Okay. The gentleman in green.
Professor Diamond. it is obvious that when the states want to consolidate the democracy, they always experience some painful experiences, like social disorder, some demonstration like in Taiwan now. Do you think some preconditions like sound economic condition, education level can lessen this kind of painful experience? And if the answer is yes, do you think it is justified for the authoritarian state to resist or delay the transition to democracy? Thank you.
Do I think it's justified for what kind of state to resist democracy?
For those
Authoritarian state. Okay. Are there preconditions for democracy? That's a really interesting question. You know, again, my mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset, was one of the early seminal theorists about this. He wrote an essay that was published in the American Political Science Review in 1959 called Some Social Requisites of Democracy. And he talked about how economic development is a requisite of democracy, and not so much in itself, but because it tends to generate a more vigorous civil society, a more tolerant political culture, a more educated and participatory population, and so on. In subsequent decades, people forgot precisely his phrasing and quite literally what he said in his essay, and took his argument to mean that they were prerequisites for democracy. That's not what he argued at the time, and more powerfully, it's not what we see from the data and experience over the last 3 decades, where we see many poor countries becoming democracies and remaining democracies. Why are they able to remain democracies? Because they have developed a political culture through other means of freedom, participation, tolerance, and mutual respect, because they have developed among their elites, this is crucially important, a system of what Robert Dahl, the famous Yale political scientist, calls mutual security, a set of understandings and reassurances that no matter who wins power, the basic interests and concerns of the other parties and factions will not be crushed and trampled upon. That power will be used within certain limits, and that there'll be some degree, sometimes through various constitutional means, of the sharing and checking of power. So everybody can have some sense of basic political security. Now, if you've got that, you don't need many other preconditions. I came to the conclusion about 15 years ago that the only precondition for democracy is a resolve on the part of a country's elite that they want it for their country for whatever reason. It could be purely instrumental. And sometimes democracy has been chosen in the world because it was the only means that elites could agree upon institutionally of managing and resolving their differences short of war or continued war. So sometimes democracy becomes a means of settling civil wars. This was historically the case in Europe. It's remained the case in a surprising number of countries in the world today. El Salvador, Mozambique, now hopefully Sierra Leone, among others. So those are the only preconditions, I think. And the other conditions for democracy can emerge through the functioning of democracy. You know, one of the most absurd comments, I don't want to be too dismissive here, but one of the most absurd comments that was made in response to my remarks in Singapore, and they were published in the newspaper along with the summary of my remarks, is Singapore isn't ready for democracy yet. We don't have a political culture and a civil society to sustain it. When we do, then we can have democracy. Well, I would say 2 things. Number one, everything is relative. And secondly, so, you know, an adequate political culture and civil society compared to what? Number 2, what is keeping Singapore from having a civil society robust enough to sustain democracy. It's the laws on association that keep people from forming civil society organizations independent of the state. When you lift those laws, you will get in very short order a robust, vigorous, liberal democracy sustaining civil society in Singapore. This is another way of saying that the conditions that make democracy meaningful, vigorous, liberal, constitutional, law-abiding, tolerant, and of high quality, more often than not emerge through the functioning of democracy, early on, not very pretty, not very liberal, needing reform in a lot of ways, than they do through having an authoritarian regime that preserves itself for a long period of time, with the idea that somehow later on in the indefinite future you're going to get democracy springing fully formed like Zeus from the brow of Athena.
Larry, thank you for excellent speech. Larry and I are good friends, so I don't mind. I think he doesn't mind my asking a question. I've been reflecting about the assumptions that the electoral competition can actually lead to the best outcome or desirable outcome. And I think one of the things, like in economics, political competition also depends very much on people being well informed, right? Because I mean, you know, information asymmetry really is really what destroys the benefits of a free market. And I wonder whether you can comment whether that we really have two types of problems. One is ignorance, okay, and people could be uneducated or they don't want to be informed, okay, which basically will diminish the probability that the electoral results would actually give you the best results. But the other one would be sort of deliberate lies and propaganda on the other side that would also lead to basically an outcome that's not desirable. And this can happen in the U.S., right? You know, that
Can or does?
or did, right? Did. So my question is, how could one protect against this? Because if you want to argue that the electoral competition leads to the best outcome, one must have safeguards that at least the people voting have the right information. We know that in the economy, the stock market, in the stock market, for example, the SEC makes sure that their disclosure, transparency, and truthfulness, right? But how do we do it in the political context? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good and challenging question, and I think quite an appropriate one, not only for prospective democracies, but also for existing democracies. So first of all, let me say that I think transparency and wide access to information is very important. So this is why I favor institutional provisions that provide free or subsidized access to the media, if not for all political parties, then for all political parties who've demonstrated in the last election that they have some minimum degree of electoral support. And the more information you can get out through the electronic media in particular, I think is extremely important, the better chance you have of people having some minimum degree of information. Now, this doesn't eliminate, and in fact could exacerbate, the second problem you mentioned of propaganda and deceit, including lying not only about your own programs, but about your opponent's record. There's nothing that can prevent someone from being dishonest about what they plan to do in the future. But I do think that democracy provides means of accountability over time for correcting that. And let me say that sometimes public officials in a democracy will say they're not going to do something. For example, not going to impose painful economic but necessary economic reforms. They have to lie about that in order to get elected. Then they get elected and they impose the painful but necessary economic reforms that they said they weren't going to do. I mean, I think we have to live with a certain amount of this disingenuous behavior in a democracy, because the people will then have the means in the next election to punish the incumbent if that reform turns out not to have been desirable by them. But very frequently, after they've done what they said they didn't do, the reform turns out not only to have been necessary, but ultimately to yield better results. Sometimes they're reelected, as we see in the experience of Central and Eastern Europe, the former communist countries. Sometimes they're punished in the next election, but 20 years the society looks back and thanks them for what they did. What I think can be done by an electoral commission or media board is to sanction and punish parties and candidates who deliberately, maliciously distort the record of their opponents and lie about it in a way that is demonstrable. And some countries do that.
Okay, because of time limit, I would like to ask those of you who have questions, all raise your hands, and then we will go for all the questions.
Do you want to take them all at once, and then I'll answer them all at once?
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Professor Lee first.
Yeah, Professor Diamond, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I noticed in your slide, you mentioned there are 4 liberal democracies in Asia. So could you name them, and also how you compare them with those in Western Europe in terms of the performance? Thank you.
Professor, you mentioned that economic development is an important factor towards transition into democracy, but doesn't that contradict the statement that democracy is not an extravagant for the poor, but a necessity? Thank you.
Professor Lee.
I want you to let you know that I really enjoy your lecture.
Well, thank you.
That said, my question to you is that you have looked at the spread of democracies, largely in terms of electoral democracies. You did touch on the civil liberties and civil rights. What if you take the civil liberties and civil rights more systematically into the equation of spreading democracies? Would you be somewhat less optimistic about the democratization from the global perspective?
Okay, Mike. You should ask the last one because your wife asked the first one.
Oh, very good. That seems fair, but we have equality here in my family. You've raised the question, Larry, in both in the media this morning, I read in the newspaper, but also today. You've mentioned this parliamentarism. And of course, and you've referenced this specifically to Hong Kong. Of course, in Hong Kong, this is not a new idea. It's been bandied about in the academy for years. And after some elections, Democratic camp has been, when they're particularly euphoric, have even suggested that the chief executive maybe appoint a cabinet of Democrats and that they form a government, in effect, within the existing constitution, where I suppose the chief executive would then be expected to step back and let them carry on. But how do you think Hong Kong might get there? I mean, there's got to be some kind of strategy that you think may be effective. I assume it's some kind of inclusiveness, but I'd like to hear some elaboration of the argument I read in the Post this morning. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank all of you very, very much. The liberal democracies in East Asia, as measured by the Freedom House scale of political rights and civil liberties, are 3 you can guess and 1 that perhaps you wouldn't. And I'd say it's very ambiguous. You might get there statistically, but I don't think you could call it that if you look at it carefully today. So they are Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. I mean, Taiwan, for all its problems, is an amazingly free society. That's why you have, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets right now. I know some people think it's too free, but having lived there for a year, I can tell you it's very appealing, and I think the Taiwanese have come to deeply value their freedom, and it would be very, very hard to take it away. True as well for the Koreans, where I think that governance really has been improved in a lot of ways that have not been adequately appreciated by the outside world as a result of democratic engagement and reform by civil society and through the political process. I realize none of the 4 elected presidents in this period have been remarkably successful individually, but I think the system has been more successful than it's given credit for. The 4th is Mongolia, and that's where I think, you had a rather liberal Mongolia under the Democratic Party. The former communists have come in and I think really rolled things back in a number of ways. Is there a contradiction between saying democracy is economic development is a requisite for democracy and democracy is a requisite for improving the lives of the poor? Well, if you put it in those terms, I guess there is. But I'd say, I repeat, I'm refashioning the theory. I don't think it's economic development itself that is necessary for democracy. Obviously, as people become better educated and more prosperous, more becomes possible in terms of being able to realize and enact the full range of citizenship rights and responsibilities. But what is it about economic development that tends to contribute to democracy? Again, it's a political culture of participation, moderation, tolerance, debate. It's a civil society that's able to engage people, represent their interests, challenge and check authority from time to time. It's a level of information, coming back to knowledge and information, that flows throughout the society and makes people better informed citizens. It's possible gradually over time, and I think India's experience is instructive here, though let's not romanticize it, but it's possible over time to get these things through democracy. And one of the things that democracy has done is to enable people to defend their rights and to get the system to be accountable and responsive to them. This is why, actually, the poor vote in higher numbers than upper income people do in India, and why there are so many associations of poor people. The third question was about whether I am as optimistic about the spread of liberty as I am about the spread of democracy, or at least in terms of my assessment. And I don't think it's obvious from the data that the spread of liberty has gone as far as the spread of democracy, and it's precisely one of the things I worry about, that there are so many illiberal democracies. Now, as I articulated in my book, Developing Democracy, I think liberal democracy is not only about freedom of speech, of the press, of association, of movement, and so on and so forth. It's also about a rule of law that not only constrains the power of the executive, but that constrains the behavior of everybody and generates order and predictability, not only in economic life, but in political and social life. And therefore, obviously, there are tensions in this, and there are different ways of balancing this depending on cultural values. I believe there can be, for example, a Confucian style or more communitarian-oriented liberal democracy. But in the end, there has to be some balance. And one of the things that worries me is precisely that governance is so disorderly, corrupt, and bad in many of the new democracies that have emerged. This is why the initiative that the World Bank is taking now to make corruption and fighting corruption a major priority in its work, I think is so important. And it's why I think the battle against corruption, which is to my mind one of the greatest cancers, eating away at the viability of and public confidence in democracy around the world, should be one of the highest priorities in the aid programs and general engagement of the West toward the Western rich democracies, toward the developing or potentially developing areas of the world. Nevertheless, with that said, I would note that there have been some, noteworthy improvements in levels of freedom and gradually, in some ways, in the quality of governance in some of the new democracies of the world. And I think freedom can be a tool for civil society to organize to get more order and better rule of law, which means an independent and effective judiciary and better governance. And here I think a country like Ghana is very important to look at. It's a generally free country now. And it's a relatively better governed country than a lot of the other new democracies in Africa. But when I was there last year, I was told by a very high member of the judiciary that they have only half of the funding they need for the judiciary. The counter-corruption institutions are not really working very seriously, and yet aid money is being poured into Ghana because it's less corrupt than the other African countries. So I am optimistic, yes. I mean, you saw the numbers. Freedom is improving too in the world. It's not just democracy, but it's not improving enough. And it's not the only thing that matters in getting a truly high-quality democracy. We have to worry about the other elements of stateness and governance that have to do with order and the rule of law, and very importantly, state capacity in terms of the Weberian state's ability to be a neutral and effective instrument for mediating among societal interests, implementing policies, and delivering the goods. Finally, to Michael's question, Michael Davis, my dear friend and colleague, about how Hong Kong might get from here to there in terms of parliamentary democracy. Gee, thanks a lot for asking that. That's a very tough question, in part because it's an awkward question for me to answer as an American. I would just say the following. Obviously, there needs to be a degree of pragmatism. Hong Kong is not going to get anywhere in terms of democratic development, institutionally, formally, without the consent of Beijing. And so that's why I said what I said in a newspaper interview yesterday. I think unless very broad consensus is fashioned in Hong Kong on the institutional formulas and directions that may make democracy possible and real, but at the same time not make it threatening to many of the interests here and in the rest of China that worry about what democracy in Hong Kong might look like. If that consensus can be forged, then I think there's a much better prospect of effectively engaging the Beijing authorities in a dialogue about how democracy might be structured and how the path might be tread. I just think that the natural consequence of this, without going into detail that I'm simply not going to go into, is that people need to start talking to one another more effectively and maybe a little more respectfully than they have done in the past, and need to show a greater willingness. I realize it's not been absent, but perhaps a greater willingness to reach across some of the divides in this society and political system to see where they can find common ground. Thank you.
I wish we could have had more time for questions, but thanks, Larry. And lastly, we would like to invite our Vice Chancellor, Professor Lawrence Lau, to present souvenirs to Professor Larry Diamond.